Thank you everyone for turning out, and thanks to the audience who's tuning in live on our This Is Your Texas Facebook group. Thank you to Adrian, to St. Philip's College, and the Alamo Colleges District for hosting this event. And a huge thank you to Marcia Hall, Kim Thompson, and Ruben Guerrero for their help in organizing the event. Thank you to our sponsors, the Texas Association of School Business Officials, Pearson, ETS, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Sid Richardson Foundation. And thank you to our media partners, KENS, Texas Public Radio, and the Rivard Report. Though donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content, panelists, or line of questioning. And as many of you likely know, or hopefully know, the Texas Tribune is a nonprofit, nonpartisan digital news outlet covering statewide policy and politics issues here in Texas. That means all of our journalism, including events like this one, is made possible by members just like you. If you'd like to support our work, I hope you'll become a member today at texastribune.org/join. If everyone could take a moment and make sure that your phones are silent. But we do encourage you to tweet. If you are going to tweet, please use the hashtag TTEvents. So we'll have about an hour for the full event, including 20 minutes of Q&A. And there might be some questions coming from our Facebook group as well. So you'll get to ask our panelists any burning questions you have. So with that, let's just get straight into the event. We have 3 panelists today. Unfortunately, State Representative Diego Bernal could not make it today, but we have 3 other great panelists. I'll start with Brian Sparks, who's the principal at Lamar and Bowden in San Antonio ISD. He's a San Antonio native and a graduate of Trinity University. He also spent 8 years as a teacher and administrator in Northeast ISD. And there's Diana Herrera, who is a former student and teacher in Edgewood ISD. She was in Edgewood when, during the '68 walkouts. She actually chose not to walk out that day, but her husband Richard did. And they are still together today. He's in the audience. And lastly, we have Al Kauffman, who is a law professor at St. Mary's University. He was the lead attorney representing property poor school districts in early school finance cases against the state. And he also attended segregated schools in Galveston and graduated 11 years after Brown versus Board of Ed. So to jump in to this topic, I, along with my fellow reporter Alexa Ura, who couldn't be here today, spent about a year traveling the state and spent a lot of time in San Antonio talking to people about the legacy of school segregation in Texas. After Brown versus Board of Ed, a lot of Texas school districts did not integrate or did not desegregate their schools. And then there was a more or less statewide federal court order that forced school districts to actually go through the process of racial integration. But we also found in talking to people now that integration is not a common mechanism that the state is using or that school districts are using, and especially not racial integration as a form of getting students, getting students of color and white students on the same page. I think we are talking a lot more about school finance. We're talking about ways to close the achievement gap. Do we think that integration or racial integration specifically today is obsolete as a form of getting to racial equity for students?
Who are you asking? I mean,
you're probably the best person to start.
I'll start. I think that racial integration is an important goal which we have to pursue. It's both a matter of equity. Everyone should have the same opportunities in every district. It's a matter of educational policy. The research is all showing now that actually going to integrated schools is good for all students. It's good for students of every ethnicity, and that should be our goal. I'm given Texas's demographics in many districts. It's a hard goal to achieve, I admit that, but I think it's an important goal. It's certainly not passé. It ought to be a goal for all of us at the state level, at the county level, at the school district level, at the community organization level. All of us need to pursue more integration and see it as a major goal.
Why do you think it's seen as something that is impossible for some people?
Well, I think people look at the very segregated districts where you have individual districts that are all of one race, and there are many of those. I've represented districts along the Texas border in San Antonio and around the state, and most of them are almost all Mexican American. There are a few districts in Texas actually that are almost all African American, but there's a lot of segregation in the districts. But the growth in San Antonio, in the state of Texas, is in the suburban districts. And the suburban districts tend to be more integrated as a district. There's a lot of potential there for those districts to develop in an integrated way, for them to encourage integrated neighborhoods, for them to design their schools so they'll be integrated, and for them to see that as a goal as they're developing those districts. Districts in Texas, just in San Antonio, have grown so quickly. When I first worked with Northside ISD, they had 50,000 students, and now they have over 100,000. They build new high school every few years, middle schools every year, elementary schools several, and those can be designed to be more integrated, and that should be their goal.
I would also add that we are segregated by design. Whenever you look at how our housing is built and how our schools are constructed, how we historically have gone to neighborhood schools, there's a number of structures that are in place that segregate students just by the way that schools function and neighborhoods function. And until we interrupt that history, we will continue as districts grow and shift and evolve. We will continue to have students that are segregated unless we do things that are in direct contrast to those structures that are in place.
Mom graduated from Edgewood High School, the old original one on Couples Road. And when she was young, we had the Verstoffs, and we had the Persines, and we had the Vandewalis, and we had fields of flowers, fields of corn all over the school district. Little by little, Mom says that the community started to change. And of course, it was English only. Mom says she was in the 3rd grade and recalls clearly 3rd grader crying and running out of the classroom to one of the older sisters because she had no idea what was going on because my grandparents spoke Spanish only. So when I started at Edgewood, we already had a group of our black community, and I was just, know what I did? They said about the mute button. Okay, it's so funny because a friend of mine that graduated from Edgewood right after me, just the other day because it's Black History Month, sent me a flyer. The flyer is from June 19th, which is a lesson in itself, 1955, Express News. And I really want to read exactly what it says because it says, "New homes for colored." That's exactly what it said. And they were selling from Acme Road and Old Highway 90, right down the center of Edgewood ISD, and the homes were for $7,800. But those homes were only open to the soldiers, to the civil service men, women, but you mostly men at that time, that were going to have a job or were being stationed at Kelly or at Lackland. So when we entered Edgewood High School, we had a good number of black students come in with us. At that time, we could already see all of our white students were already beginning to leave. So that's a topic, that's my input on that one.
Yeah. I think, now with a lot of the federal courts not being involved as they were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, forcing school districts to integrate, there's a lot more now that relies on parental choice, on the decisions that parents make for where to take their kids, and then what districts do, to sort of encourage parents to go to certain places. And obviously, San Antonio ISD has done a lot of work in socioeconomic integration, and part of that is by creating school districts that end up enrolling students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds and also higher. I'm wondering what the responsibility is for the school district and administrators and for parents to avoid replicating the inequity in a system that depends on parental choice.
I think we have a huge responsibility. I think that is one of our main roles as a school district, is to help our families, all families, have access to really high quality education. And we know that integrated schools are better for all kids. So I think we are taking and will take a leadership role in helping families understand the landscape of school choice and neighborhood schools and all the different options that are out there. And then equipping them and our schools with the resources to help create great places everywhere that kids go. And our district has taken a really forward stance in a way that makes me proud to be a staff member of our district and a resident in our community. It gives me a sense of pride to know that we are really taking this issue from the very front, instead of letting issues that have occurred historically continue, and helping families both attend schools and make every single school a place where it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. We can give you a great education, and we can do it together with you.
I wanted to follow up on a few points, if I could, that Mr. Spark made and Mr. Herrera. The districts were drawn not by God. The districts were drawn by people who had politics in mind and knew who they wanted to go to school with and who they didn't. And that's created a lot of the segregation that exists now. In San Antonio, as well as in every city in Texas, there were restrictive deeds where African Americans and Latinos could not live in certain neighborhoods. Even I live in the Jefferson area, Monte Vista, other areas like that had restrictive covenants in their deeds on who could buy and who couldn't, and that was through the 50s. You mentioned the Supreme Court. I go through a real quick history, but we all know about Brown in 1954, Brown v. Board. The Supreme Court didn't really get serious about integration until the late 60s, early 70s, when they really began to force school districts to take action. Then there were changes in the politics of the country, and by around the early 1990s, they began to back off. The Supreme Court did not put pressure on the districts. They let districts get out from under their desegregation orders. They didn't require so much integration to occur, either in students or faculty or programs, staff, extracurricular, all that was under the court orders, and they let them out. So there's a lot of responsibility in a lot of places. But in Texas, the district lines were drawn very often to include certain populations and to exclude others. And we in San Antonio know that very well.
I know that when Henry B. Gonzalez became our city councilman, 53, 55, no one by the last name of Gonzalez, Guerrero, Garcia, Hernandez, no one could purchase a home right beyond Culebra, where St. Mary's University is. Could not purchase a home. As a matter of fact, when he became city councilman, I understand, I've heard that he's the one who began making those changes. And you mentioned a voucher. Did I hear that at any point of the private?
No, but I know that Edgewood has a history with.
Yeah, and because I did want to point that out to everyone. Edgewood, once again, 16 square miles, 12,000 kids, 2 high schools. But in 1998, that summer of 98, we, the teachers, started finding out that some of our students were receiving letters, and the letters were being mailed out to the home of Joe Garza, to the home of Mary Hernandez. And when we, as the teachers, started discussing all this, we found out that those letters were only going to the students that had passed their score, their TAS, I'm going to say at that time. Now, Some moms had 4 kids, 2 were special ed or were having some type of language impediment. They were seeing specialists. Those 2 kids did not receive letters. The other 2 kids received the letter for. So once again, the point that I'm trying to make here is how they have split even the kids within our own campuses.
And I think, when we looked at Edgewood specifically, we talked to you, we talked to students who had just graduated from Edgewood ISD, and we heard pretty similar stories about, they didn't feel like when they graduated, they were as prepared as students from districts that were more resourced, or had more families who had resources. Do you think that the pessimist in me wants to say that that means that very little has changed over time? Do you feel like that's a fair assessment of how of Texas over time?
I think it's still happening. It's still happening because I'm lucky enough to be called by some of my fellow teachers that they asked me to come speak to the girls or the guys at the high schools, the middle schools, and still there are students that the counselor has not met with. Still there are students that the counselor has said, you're not going to college. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was a junior in high school. The classmates were called into the cafeteria. I'm sitting there in a classroom wondering why my name wasn't called. So being that I'm a vocal person, I go into the counseling department. I said, why haven't I been called? Why isn't my name on the list? And they said, no, Diana, you're not getting married. You're going to marry Richard and have children. So I drove myself, and I've done this for all these years, I drove myself from 34th Street, Edgewood High School, to 24th Street, Our Lady of the Lake. I walked in by myself. No one to help me, no one to guide me, no grants, no scholarships, not even the NDSL that would have been paid back, not even that. I got a loan of which we paid back every single penny. So whenever I speak to students, I say, don't let someone tell you that you're not college material. Don't allow it.
What do you see as a principal in San Antonio ISD?
I would say that it may be even more dangerous and more problematic now than it was 30, 40 years ago, because so much of it goes without being said publicly. A lot of, like when I first got to Lamar 6 years ago, our enrollment was half what it is now, and there were so many families who lived in the neighborhood who did not send their kids to school, who would come maybe visit or check it out, but as soon as they would observe students in the hallways or in classrooms, they would veil their comments to me and to say, I just don't think it's a really good fit. I really, there's like, I don't think my students will fit in. Like my child will fit in with these kids. Like so much it was kind of sort of like hidden comments that was hiding the truth that they felt strongly uncomfortable sending their predominantly white kids who come from middle and upper class backgrounds to a school with Hispanic poor kids. And that's really what they were saying. And for a lot of those families, I was happy to educate them on the school and then not spend a lot of intellectual energy trying to convince them to come. It's the families who have looked at the school, looked at the work that's happening there, looked at the experiences that kids are having, looked at the value that you can get from having your child in a diverse community with lots of different colors of skins and income levels, and saying this is a valuable place for my kid to learn from and with. And those are the people that I think that we build momentum around and support and nurture those relationships, and because they are willing to engage in the conversation and willing to cede some of the power that they have inherited, and really open to exposing their child to a different future. And those are the people that give me hope. And there's many more of those than I think the other way around. Is my hope, but there's definitely an underlying unspoken narrative that is not healthy for certainly the schools that I work at or the community that I want to live in.
And where do you, I mean, when you hear those veiled remarks, where do you think that comes from for those families?
I think it comes from a lot of places. I think it comes from privilege, power, often being white and living in a world where you've had that power and privilege for a long time. I think it comes from living in a bubble in some cases and not really getting outside of that bubble. I think it comes from lived experiences that may or may not be positive, and you're informing the future, or you're sort of projecting those onto a larger subgroup. I think it comes from fear of the unknown, fear of you know, there's a lot of people who will say that they will, they'll say sort of broad comments about what sort of school they want to send their child to, and then when it comes down to their own child and their own child's experience, they make a different choice that's in contradiction to what they espouse. And so why is that? Like how far are you willing to go to help our city and our nation become a greater place, and a more diverse place, and a more welcoming and empathic place? And it often stops when it comes down to looking at your own child and saying, I want them to have friends, and I think those friends have to be white. And so I'm going to send them into this school over here.
Al, do you think Texas has made progress?
Yes, I do. I think there has been some progress. I worked in school finance. In the school finance area, there's actually more equity than there was at one time. In terms of desegregation, there aren't as many completely segregated districts as there were back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But meanwhile, we're facing tremendous changes in the demographics of the state, and the state hasn't reacted. We have so many more people classified as poor. We have so many more poor students. We have so many more students needing bilingual education, so many more students in special ed. And all of these pressures are put on the school districts to try to deal with. The folks in Austin seem to think that, you know, we're putting 20% more money in, so the test scores should go up 20%, and not realizing that it costs a lot more to run a school. So there are challenges now. I do think there has been some success in the quality of funding. I think as far as segregation is concerned, I think there's increasing segregation in the large urbans to a great deal because of white flight, because white families have moved out. We might get into the issue of charter schools and vouchers. I think some of those might have been well-intentioned, but some of those are used as ways to escape a desegregated environment, and I think that's a real challenge for all of us. So I do think there's progress, but we have a lot to do here in Texas for sure.
When we're talking about school finance, I think that is the main way that right now, at least the state is looking toward equity. There's also the accountability system, but I think especially this legislative session, that's what lawmakers are talking about, changing the way that money is allocated to specific school districts, which is obviously, as Al knows well, something they've been doing for decades now. Are there lessons that advocates now who are trying to get these reforms through should be taking from early battles for integration?
Well, yeah, and remember there's a overlap here. Generally, Latino kids and black kids go to school in poor school districts. I mean, it's not a perfect relationship. There's a lot of minority kids in Austin and in Houston and even the wealthy oil districts in West Texas. But the pattern is clear, and has been for the last 40 or 50 years in Texas, that the lowest wealth districts are almost all Latino and to some extent African American. And the wealthiest districts are much less minority. So there's an overlap there. The relationship is that as we design school finance systems, we have to account for that. And I think that we actually need a compensatory model, not even an equality model. I think even trying, first of all, Texas never completely equalized the system, but to make it really equal, the state's going to have to go beyond that. The state's going to have to figure out a way to actually spend more on those poor districts, the ones who suffered in the past, the very segregated districts, to try to bring them up. And that's going to be a heavy burden for the legislature, but I think that's what needs to be done. I think that's the lesson to be learned.
1984-ish, we ended up with the weights put on so that we could get a little more funding for our bilingual teachers, our ESL teachers, our compensatory ed instructors. But it's been over 30 years, I'm going to say 34, 35, something like that years, and it hasn't been done anymore. So we're still working with something that was given, no, not given. Oh, what would be a better word than given? One? In 1984, right around that. I'm trying to think where I was teaching that year, so I'm thinking 84.
And at the time, did that help for you as someone who was teaching in a low-income school district?
Of course. I remember getting some funding, and I don't remember what year that was. It was the year that we had that big pep rally at the Kennedy football stadium.
It was 89.
It was 89. That year, I remember receiving more money, and we finally received our first certified PE teacher, certified librarian. We ended up with a reading specialist. We ended up with a math specialist. You know, we had so many people, and that was a year or two after that is when Edgewood became, I'm going to think, academically recognized. I believe that was it. And I remember all of us saying, it's simple. Just give us the educators, give us the programs so we can work with these children. And sure enough, we proved our point.
Al, I think you were the one who brought up charters. I think, there are a lot more charter schools, charter districts in San Antonio now, obviously, than there were decades ago, before charters existed in Texas. How do you see that impacting the possibility for integration in San Antonio schools, whether that's racial or socioeconomically?
I think that the charters will probably not make all that much difference. I think there's still a fairly small number of them. I think people who design schools thinking they're going to make an immediate profit don't understand how to run a school. And there were private entities that go out and say that they can have a new model that will, for the same price, we're going to raise scores faster, we're going to decrease dropouts, and it just can't be done with the same amount of money unless you choose your kids. And we were talking about that before. If you allow me to choose which kids I'll have, I'll do very well. My son went to Health Careers High School here in San Antonio. Very happy to get him in. Health Careers consistently is the highest ranked school in the area, but Health Careers admits students who do well before they get there. So it makes it a little bit easier. So I think that if Mr. Spark can choose his students at each school, his schools will all do better. I just guarantee it. But the charter schools, I think, can be a real challenge. I think that as time goes by, if boards and the communities are sophisticated enough to see that there's no panacea, there's no one model that's going to use the same amount of money and double our production, then I think that'll be less of an effect in the future.
I think there's some lessons learned that the state could use for the funding system that districts are already using that allow them to be more nimble, more customizable on campuses. Like one thing that we're doing is the use of master teachers. I spent the first chunk of my career wondering why the very best teachers weren't being paid more and sent to schools that had the most needs. And I could not figure it out about why that wasn't happening and why we couldn't design a system that would allow us to both recruit, retain talent at schools that had the absolute greatest needs. That's what we're doing now in San Antonio ISD. We are paying teachers more who are the best teachers to come to our district, to stay in our district, and to stay in classrooms working with kids. We are providing schools that are effective and are doing great work, more choice and more autonomy over time, saying that school leaders, we trust you to do great work. You've already proven that from your recent historical success. We're going to give you a little bit more latitude here. And that goes into budgetary things. It goes into other ways that schools function. So I think that the nimbleness with which a district could function, even a large district, may have some lessons learned that the state could use to inform how they fund schools. So it's not just equal across the board within a margin. Yeah.
I think also San Antonio ISD is in a position of, both competing with charters, but also partnering with them. So I think there's it's not just competition that's happening in San Antonio at ISD, at least, with charter.
Yeah, I was in a principal meeting, and Mr. Martinez got on the mic, and he opened one of his sessions with, we are not fighting with charters, we are embracing and we are going to work in concert with them. And that was such a different narrative than what I think is being supported, shared, vocalized at the state level. And like we are interested in doing really high quality work for kids. And one way we get funded is through our enrollment. So we can do all of this together, and it can all work together with the puzzle pieces, and we don't need to be in opposition or battling with these charter organizations. There are things that are happening in those buildings that are really great for kids, and there's teachers that are working extremely hard. Like, how can we learn from and with them? Is something for, I think, districts to think about, and something that I think I wouldn't be thinking as much about if a superintendent wasn't saying those things.
So studies have shown that students of color benefit from having educators that look like them. And some of the earlier court orders also looked at, what is the racial makeup of the educators in the school district, as well as the student body. But in Texas, I think, especially with the demographic change, we're now a majority Hispanic school system, and most of the teachers, at least in Texas schools, are white. For you specifically, Principal Sparks, how does your race impact the work that you're able to do in schools that are majority Hispanic?
We did a study in the fall at Lamar on telling our racial autobiographies. And so we would do some writing, and we would do some sharing, and as a way to work towards connecting better with our students and understanding their racial journey. And as people talked around the room, and it came to me, and we were sharing in groups, I didn't think about my racial identity really until I was a graduate student and I was working in schools. It was not something I thought about. And then to parallel that with the stories I heard around the room, where it was the most important part of their journey, of their life journey, was their race. And that informed every single decision that they made. And then to place that perspective in the eyes of a child who's in our schools right now, who's Hispanic or Black or white, and they're seeing people who may or may not look like them. And if you're a Black child or a Hispanic child, they're very likely not to look like you, and that's problematic. So I both have some understanding of that, not to the depth that a Black or Hispanic child or adult could have. So I think one is just to learn and to listen. And we've tried to do that in really intentional ways at Lamar, and then over time we will over at Bowdoin. And then to understand the journey, the racial journey, but the journey of the child who's sitting in the room with us. What is their lived experience, and how does it inform their actions? How does it inform their family's actions? And what's our role as a school, and certainly my role as one of the leaders of the school, to make space for them and to make sure that they can take as many risks with their learning as we can possibly allow them to. And so many times I think we limit and then perpetuate the problems that are inherent in our schools and our society out of fear, I think, primarily. So I think I've tried to be as transparent and open and honest with our staff about my vulnerabilities and it's sort of risky for me to talk about my race. And then to really position our students to have safe spaces to learn and to talk about and debate issues that directly connect to their racial identity and their cultural identity as well.
Diana, yeah.
I'd like to just add something. If you're interested in data, stats, charts, graphs, studies, idra.org. I have done workshops with 40 teachers, 40 educators, and I tell them, just think of a question. Think of an educational question. Now let's get on their website, and all of them find an answer. IDRA, and the reason I push it because IDRA was started by my superintendent, Dr. Cardenas, from Edgewood.
Yeah, I was going to ask about being a student in a majority Hispanic school district and then going back to be an educator in that same school district. You know, in terms of the experiences you had as a student versus as an educator, how did you feel the district had changed or that your perspective had changed?
I don't think it even changed. As a matter of fact, I was speaking to someone from Edgewood just about a week ago, and they want me to go back and work. You know, Diana, if you want to pick Tuesday, Thursday, and I said, well, I don't get up early, I'm retired. Okay, after lunch. So anyway, they're offering me all these little things to work with some tough, disciplined students. Diana, we hear, because this woman doesn't even know who I am, I retired 15 years ago. So she says, Diana, I hear that you work so well with these kids. Well, number one, I'm one of those kids. Number two, that was my school. You know, immediately that connection. I listen, I read, we read each other. And then I told her, and you want to know why I work so well with them? I said, because I married a hoodlum. I said, so... I said, so I've got experience on the job training. But it does make a difference. It truly does make a difference. In my point of view, in my eyes, perhaps if I had taught at Richland, what's the name of that school district way out there? Richardson, maybe my thoughts would be different. Perhaps it'd be different. Richardson.
So we're going to go to questions in a little bit, but I wanted to ask one last question. How do we, as a state, I guess, but you know, individually in communities, I think people who are watching are watching from their individual communities. They know their schools and school districts. You know, what do they need in order to be able to make sure that there is equity in their own communities?
Well, I want to support what she said about IDRA. Jose Cardenas started, but IDRA is a group in San Antonio that has a wonderful website, but they do instruction and teaching and guiding and studying and testifying, and my two teachers in school finance are both IDRA, Dr. Jose Cardenas and Albert Cortez, and they are the best. Now, they have an excellent website, interactive website. People can go on and find out about their own district, what their own district's finances are, and what the needs are for their own district, as well as for the whole state. And by the way, the other organizations are also doing some of that. I think IDRA's might be a little bit more objective than some of the others, but I would suggest that you go on those websites. I think going to the school board meetings every year and talking about we need to have more advocacy for better funding, we need to have more minority teachers, we need to have more sensitivity to our students. All those are important things. I want to go back to a little bit about what they used to call the role model, about having a person of your own race teach you. I think it's a real positive, and having Ms. Herrera teach the kids would be very, very important. Unfortunately, the state of Texas has not produced nearly enough Latino and African American teachers for the students. So we need to try harder to help develop them and to hire them when you get them, and to grow our own has to be done. But those of us who are not minorities still have to do our best to be sensitive to it. By the way, it's sort of full circle. The things that Ms. Herrera was talking about, and Mr. Spark, about having people understand people's racial journeys, how they grew up and their life journeys, that can happen so well when in an integrated environment. And kids today who never go to school with somebody of a different race never get to share that. And that's how, I mean, it's one thing to sit in a group and say, well, we're going to sit here and we're going to talk about each other's racial journeys. It's another thing to actually live around people, see them grow up, talk to their families, and see where they came from. Before we end the questioning period, I want to make sure I compliment the Texas Tribune on this great series. Ms. Swaby and her partner did just a wonderful job on studies on Edgewood, San Antonio, Longview, other districts statewide. I mean, I've been doing this for about 40 years, and I learned a lot from reading it, and I appreciate it very much. I
Thank
just want to make sure
you.
we hats off to you. And IDRA, they're wonderful.
Oh, I think they're wonderful.
Any last thoughts before we go to the question and answer?
I would think that anytime something bugs me and or upsets me or gets me where I know I'm getting angry, you know, I think about the 48-hour rule. Like, if I can live through a couple more days, and if things do not change at all, would I be comfortable with that? And if the answer is no, then what action would I take to change that future, whether it's 48 hours or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years? And I wonder what that action looks like for each one of us in the room, whether it comes down to Austin or school boards or mentoring students in our schools. Like, what is that action that would give us a sense of moving the needle and moving things in the right direction? You know, I have moments of pride in this work where I feel like we're really going in the right direction, and then I'm sitting here saying, like, I could do more. Like, I could do more to help this conversation and to support it both in my workplace, but also in my personal life too. You know, I can do more, and I need to be somebody who leads that conversation in both places.
And one more thing, I truly believe that if we educate the mothers, the mamas out there, the entire family learns. When we had our voucher...
About the fathers too?
No,
Fathers too?
But you know, mamas, we rule, you know that. Because when we had our voucher fight in '98, we went with MALDEF, with IDRA, with Texas Freedom Network. Everybody came to our rescue. And we went from campus to campus, campus to campus, and simply sat. We get a little group, and we talked to them, and they'd ask us questions, and we would answer. So when it finally got to the point that the legislators met in Austin, we took 4 busloads of mamas. 2 or 3 dads joined us. And those moms went and they entered and they spoke to each legislator, and they knew what they were saying. It was coming from them because they had made it a point to educate themselves on the public school system versus the charter schools that we had in Edgewood coming in. So if you educate those mamas, the family learns.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Give them a round of applause. And we'll start with questions from our Facebook group.
Yeah, so before we get to questions in the room, we have a few folks that are joining us virtually in our This Is Your Texas Facebook group. If those of you in the room are not yet in it, I recommend it. We have a lot of great conversations there. There was a lot of questions about school choice, but I think we got pretty well into that. So I'm going to pass it to a question from Hope. She says, if children don't have integrated experience in K through 12, how do these children become empowered to advocate for themselves on large Texas college campuses where they are in the minority and may need additional support?
Well, I'll try it. I think universities have to realize this, that many of the students they have grew up and went to school in very segregated environments. And I think they need to be sensitive to it. They need to know they have different communities, and they need to encourage those groups to talk to each other. I don't think you can actually make up for all of that. I consider it a deficit if you haven't had some sort of integrated environment, but they ought to be aware of it and try to respond.
All right, we've got another question from Inga. She says, are San Antonio ISD's diverse by design schools improving the state of school segregation in San Antonio?
This is not because my boss is sitting here, but the truth is that I really believe that we are at the beginning of work that is working towards desegregation in our schools. And it's really hard work to interrupt many years and decades of policies and structures that have been in place that are not moving in that direction, and it'll take time. Yes, I think that we're already seeing schools that are both being built and then designed to intentionally interrupt the way that our schools have been constructed in the past.
All right, audience questions.
Thank y'all very much. It's been very informative and enlightening, and thank you for all that y'all have done for the community. I have a question. As related, we've talked about the historical segregation, and we know about redlining and discrimination towards specific minorities in the past. And I'm just curious as to y'all's guidance or any advice you might have in the role schools play as related to possible gentrification that's going on right now, in particular Principal Sparks, I know. I'm curious as to what you have to say as to the role that schools might play in relation to gentrification and displacement of families, particularly in the inner cities and where there's been a lot of flipping of houses and displacement of those that were affordable. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that this impacts both schools that I serve. When I got to Lamar 6 years ago, it was a conversation we were having. Our enrollment was shrinking, and because families couldn't stay in the community. So one thing was to make sure that we were grandfathering every student back into the school, and to make sure that the kids who started our school are our kids. So when they moved, we did everything we could to make sure that those kids could stay at our school. That included bus passes, giving them rides at times, like whatever we could do within our power to make sure that they had a stable school environment. We wanted to do. And now over time, as we're moving towards a choice school model at some schools, we need to make sure that we continue to keep populations in our community that are at risk for being moved out of our community because of rents or mortgages, where we need to make sure and keep them close. So like at Lamar, we made sure that we kept our dual language program as part of our charter model. We did not want anything to happen to our bilingual population. So they came first, right? So like who are the kids that are the most at risk in our community, and what decisions are being made to make sure that they stay on the very front burner of the conversation? So that's one thing. It's like by design, like how can we create schools that every decision that we make is filtered through the lens of how is this impacting our most privileged and less privileged parts of our community. And typically the way that they're made is they're made with a lot of loud voices from the most privileged, and then either no voices or no access for the less privileged parts of our community. So I think one thing we can all do at schools is to make sure that the filtering that we use to make decisions is sent through that lens first. So the other part I think is that as we move towards choice school models, when you start that model, whatever kids you have on that first day of school is your kid, regardless of where they're coming from, right? And they are your kid as long as that school is functioning. So if they happen to move, then they still get to go to school there. We're building out bus networks within the district where they can still get bused in to the school, where because they've been displaced doesn't mean that they have to not have transportation to the school. And we have a number of students who use that. So like by design, how do we make sure that kids have continued access to the schools that they attended before, even if they are forced to move out of their community?
And one thing in Edgewood, 16 square miles, Highway 90, old Highway 90 to Culebra. And we're seeing the eminent domain, and we're discussing as a community, we're discussing what's happening, because all those little homes, and I'm talking about little homes that the great-great-great-grandparents paid for, and you still have families living in there, they're losing their homes, and that's gentrification coming in.
Hello. So this question goes a little bit to the educating mamas, right? But not exclusively. But I think, I attended a conference in Austin a few months ago called, it's an annual data institute by an organization called Good Measure. And one of the models they talked about was, I think it was called Measure. And it was really using data to create a learning community in the school with all stakeholders. And so they were able to take action based on the community education and being able to advocate and really make changes and adapt and deal with issues based on the data that the community was asking for and interpreting together. I think that I chased the lady out into the parking lot who talked about the model she had implemented. She was a mama who implemented this model. And I said, how did you get to the data literacy? And she said, that's part of the model. We teach the community how to interpret the data. So I'm just interested in your thoughts and how you empower community and really not hoard data, but really bring it down to the grassroots level and
It was
families.
data. It was data, and I'm telling you, we brought in NEA for Washington D.C., the National Education Association, and of course with IDRO, with Maldiv, with Texas Freedom Network, with all these people, who are pros in their business. They came in and they simply talked, and we did remember the old overhead projector things, and we did the stats, and we did columns and visuals, and just explained and talked to them. And it was empowering, because when those parents came back from Austin, they ruled the world. They could handle anything. It was beautiful to see. And then we had a letter writing campaign, and every school in Edgewood did writing letters to the legislators. And then I believe it was TSTA, Texas State Teachers Association, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Texas Freedom Network, who bagged letters written to each legislator, and they put a big old red bow in these clear bags. And I remember seeing the pictures when the legislators entered the chambers, these big old bags filled. That was so powerful. That was amazing.
Hello, I want to thank the panel for this opportunity to ask this question. Basically, what I'd like to know is, can you give us all, as well as those that are gathered here, and how would you advise us, as well as policymakers, on how we together can combat economic segregation as it relates to this topic, such that issues of gentrification and other things that we've talked about can be, I don't know, fought back, maybe that's too strong a word, but beaten back, if you will, for the betterment of the students that we're all talking about trying to better serve.
Well, you can't put all of that burden, of course, on the schools, but they're caught in a dilemma here where they want to improve schools to keep students going to their schools. Once they develop a very good school, that becomes a magnet for people to go into that community, and it raises the house prices, and they sort of have some gentrification. So the answer, I think, is to make sure that all of the schools and all of the districts really are good schools. I mean, I know it sounds pie in the sky, but that's the way to stop the gentrification by school districts, is to make sure that every school district has all of the funds it needs, and you've accounted for all the special costs and special needs of the districts, so that when a person's deciding where they want to go live, they don't make the decision just based on the quality of one individual school, because the schools are very good all over, and that's the only way to do it. I think we all have to keep pressure on that point. I mean, I do think, I respect what San Antonio is doing with individual schools trying to improve those and keep the kids coming. I think it's very important, but long term, the only way to stop the gentrification for school districts is to make sure that every school is so good that when parents choose, they know that they're not going to go based on the average expenditures of the school, or the average years of experience of the teachers, or the test score gains, because they're all doing well.
I think actually this is the last question we have time for.
Sorry if I'm going to be a little, preface it with a little bit of a backstory, but so at the beginning of Julian Castro's 2020 vision, I attended a housing summit in which the keynote speaker spoke on the relation between housing and education, and he said by and large in the urban core, almost every city in the nation, that if you just took the data on free and reduced lunch, it's almost an automatic indicator for achievement levels. And that attempts in maybe a model like a master teacher or any of that was important, but not going to move the needle as much. So my question is that with the model that SAISD is doing with these master teachers and choice schools, as far as student achievement is concerned, would you say it's more important to have racially integrated schools or socioeconomic integrated schools?
I think they're obviously intimately connected to each other, given the stats that we look at. And I'm hesitant to pick one or the other necessarily. I think they're both critically important to how schools function and how the district and the state thinks about how we grow really great schools together. Whenever I'm working in a school and living in the school and sort of sitting in it, I tend to think about how are we giving access, equitable access to high quality learning opportunities regardless of where you come from. I don't differentiate in my own mind into those two buckets of categories. I know that's probably not the answer you wanted, but it's more about access given the background that you're coming with, regardless of what that is. How do we account for that and then support you in offering a really enriching, high quality experience that both supports you as you learn through the years, but also supports your gaps that you have through your learning experience. So I don't. I both don't think about through that lens, and I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I think we need to think about both, and also it's highly contextual to the school that you're in, and the schools I'm in are very, very different communities. So how we interact with your question is pretty drastically different, given the context that we serve in.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, everyone, for coming. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up and talk to me and talk to our panelists for a little bit after. Thank you, everyone.